The course is BIO111. This is General Biology 1. It is for 100 level students in the departments of microbiology, plant science, biotechnology, zoology, students in SLT, students in geology and mining, and students doing biology education. This course is a 3-credit unit course, and it will be taught by 3 lecturers. We have segmented it, and this part that I will be taking is ecology. I will be taking the part on ecology. But let me give you a background. Biology, by definition, we are told it is the study of living organisms. And living organisms are categorized into plants and animals. The study of plants, we call it zoology, botany, which is now today called plant science. And the study of animals is called zoology, which is also called animal science. We also have a 3rd category of organisms that possess either both characteristics of plants and animals, and these are called the protista. We also studied them in biology. Now, ecology is neither the study of plants or animals or protista, but it is a study of the environment, the interaction that happens between plants, animals, and protista, and their environment, the interactions. And this is to show that organisms, whether plants or animals, do not live in isolation. They must live in an environment. And because they live in an environment, they interact. There is an interaction between them and the environment. And in this case, if we study plants alone, and we study animals alone or protista alone, without taking note of the environment in which they live, we would be making a great mistake, because this organism must live in an environment. And it is good as biologists to take note of their environment. And so this study is what we are referring to, the study of the animal environment, or the organism and its environment, the interactions that goes on, is what we call ecology. And so by definition, many people have defined ecology in different ways. I have tried to keep 3 points here in the different ways in which we are seeing the word ecology. The first option is that it is the study of the external environment which provides the living organism with the requirements for life. And these requirements for life are food, water, shelter. Food, water, and shelter. The living organisms, whether it's a plant or animals, will obtain and secure these requirements for life from the environment. So when we are studying this food, water, life relationship with the organism, whether plant or animals, we are doing ecology. The second line of thought about ecology is that it is the study of organism-environment relationship. The study of the relationship that exists between the organism and the environment. I remember we said what we call the environment is where the animals or the plants, living organisms, they obtain their food, water, and shelter requirements. The 3rd point that we have about ecology is that it is the study of the interaction that goes on between the biotic and the abiotic components of the environment. The study of the biotic and abiotic interactions that happens in the environment. Biotic means the living organism And abiotic means the non-living environment. There is an interaction between the living and the non-living environment. Interactions happen between these two. And when we are studying this set of interactions, what we are doing is simply called ecology. So I have said 3 things about ecology. External environments that provide the living organism with requirements for life, study of organism environment relationship, and the study of biotic abiotic interactions. There are 2 aspects of ecology. One is called ecology. What I call aspects is what some authors may refer to as types or categories. Ecology. Look at this pronunciation. It is a 2-word. There is an auth and ecology. This means the individual relationship with the environment. There is group relationship, there's individual relationship. For example, what I do with the environment is personal. It's an individual. That is one. And what human beings do with the environment is group. So if the study is referring to what I do, the individual thus within the environment, the relationship between the individual and his environment, that can be studied under a set of study that is called ecology. There is a second category or aspect of ecology that is called scene ecology. Scene ecology. This is a group relations. Like I've said, an entire population, an entire group of organisms may be interacting with the environment. And so individual and group environment, we cannot take them for being the same. And so we study them under these aspects of ecology. We are going to be considering some basic concepts and principles in ecology. Basic concepts and principles in ecology. About 5 of them are listed. But we are starting with the lower ones, and then we gradually move up to the higher ones. The first concept in ecology that is studied in ecology is what we call the habitat. The habitat concept. The habitat is defined as the place where an organism lives. Every organism has a living place that can support its life, plants or animals or protista. So that living place of the living organism, where the living organism lives, the final address, as call it the final address of the living organism. If you live in a place and you are describing where you live, you tell people I live in number so-so, street so-so, town so-so, and that means that your full address is given. And when they look for you, we can get you in that place. And so where we describe as the habitat is the place we can describe where the organism, whether it's a plant or an animal, can be found. And in terms of habitat, we have land or terrestrial habitat, we have air or arboreal habitat, and we have water or aquatic habitat. This will be explained shortly. So we have the types of habitat: terrestrial habitat, land, and aquatic habitat. These are the major. But like I said, we also have arboreal. And when we talk about aquatic habitat, we classify them into freshwater habitat. This includes streams, rivers, ponds, and lakes. The other type is marine water habitat. What differentiates between freshwater and marine water is the amount or the quantity of salt or the level of saltiness that can be found in the water. Fresh water relatively has little quantity, amount of salt. Marine water have high volume, high amount of salt. And these are usually salt water lakes, estuaries, or seas and oceans. But we also have in between them, we have what we also call them the marsh land, where seasonally you have, during the rains especially, you have flooded environments. These are, and in the dry season they become land. So This is a fluctuation between aquatic and terrestrial habitat. Then we have the arboreal habitat. Arboreal habitat. These are trees and the air where you have living organisms that they only come to the land occasionally, but they live most of their lives on trees, jumping from one tree to the other, and most of the time they are feeding on either fruits or flowers or tree and plant products. And so they hardly find any reason, they have no reason to come to land, and they don't dwell in water. In that case, we would be making will not be justifying their being terrestrial organisms. So they are arboreal, tree living organisms. We also have what we call edaphic habitat or soil habitat, where organisms live essentially burrowed under the soil, and they obtain all their living, land, food, shelter, all the requirements of life is obtained and secured from the soil. So they are called edaphic organisms, edaphic habitat. We have also another concept that is called the microhabitat. This is habitat within habitat. Habitat within habitat. For example, under the forest floor, you have a lot of leaf falls, and some organisms are not just living on the ground, on the underground of the forest, but they live on the underleaves, within the underleaves of the forest floor. And in that case, these organisms are occupying a habitat within habitat. It is a habitat within habitat, microhabitat. In other words, within a habitat, organisms select where they can do better. The second concept is a species concept. Species concept. Species, by definition, is organisms that can interbreed and reproduce viable offsprings that resemble them. This is very important. Every word here is important. Interbreed, reproduce viable organisms, offsprings, and resemble them. It means that if you have organisms within of different species, they cannot interbreed. And so long as they cannot interbreed, they cannot reproduce. Not to talk of viability of the offspring, and not to talk about resemblance. So, it is only organism, man can interbreed, humans can interbreed, human to human. A human being cannot interbreed with a dog or a goat, or a dog and goat, though they look similar. They look similar by an appearance, but they are completely different species, and therefore they cannot interbreed. So this concept of species means what is key about this definition is the ability to interbreed, the ability, the capability to produce, reproduce viable offsprings, and the offsprings must resemble the parents, like children like parents. An example, as I've seen here, is goat, dog, humans. 3 different species. Species of goat, species of dogs, and species of humans. The next concept is a concept of number 3 concept, population. Yeah, we all sometimes use these words wrongly, but the correct definition for a population means the total number of individuals of the same species. The word the same species, very key, living in a defined area at a given time. The area is defined, the time is given. And therefore we can always determine the population of an area by looking at the total number, and also looking at the area where they are occupying, because each organism within this total occupies a certain area, and at a given time. That means a population can change over time. I may have a population of 100 students in this class at this time, The class, the total number is 100. The defined area is this class. The time is now. 5 minutes after now, some students can go out and no longer have 100. The area remains the same. The time has changed. So the area may remain definite. Time may change, the number may change, and then the population can change. So there is what we call population change. And there are factors that are responsible for that. We'll look at that later. For example, the total number of tilapia fish in a pond, the total number of students in my class now, and this will form the population. Population can change over time and place. As I've said, over time and place. Critical. The fourth concept in ecology is a concept of community. Different populations, by definition, a community means different populations living and interacting together in at a given time also. Different populations. So, you can see from the definition of population, the word species is important. From the definition of community, the word population is important. Different populations. I can have goat, dog, and human beings living in the same population, occupying the same community place at a given time. That becomes a community. Different populations, many populations. In this room, in the classroom, we may have students. It's possibly there are house flies. It's possible there are mosquitoes in the same class. House fly is one population. Mosquitoes is another population. The human being, all of us are another. So 3 populations are mentioned here. We form a community. And for example, I've given an example here. I say consider a pond with fish, with algae, with mosquito larvae, and with snail, all in the same pond. It depends on which one we want to study. If we want to study the population of algae, it doesn't mean fish is absent. They are also there. And all of these interact. Remember, we talk about interactions in a community, interactions in the environment. And the 5th concept in ecology is the concept of ecosystem. Different communities of organisms interacting with themselves, and they are biotic. Where remember, we said the living organisms is called a biotic, interacting with their biotic. In that case, an ecosystem is formed. Interaction between different communities of organisms within themselves and with their biotic, the ecosystem. The ecosystem is very large. It varies in size. It could be a small rock pond, pool of water in a small pool, rock, or it could be a large river. Could be it depends on the size, but it doesn't change the component. Just that there must be some communities interacting with the biotic. And if we talk about the rock pool, the water in that pool and the organism in that pool, they all together form a community, and the interaction is the ecosystem interaction. And a large river may also similarly interact. So we look at types of ecosystem. We have defined the aquatic ecosystem. We said one of the major characteristics of the aquatic ecosystem is the water. Water. Aquatic means water. We just look at there is fresh water, and we also looked at the marine. So the second type of the ecosystem is a grassland, which is characterized by vegetation. Vegetation. Aquatic environment, aquatic ecosystem is characterized by water. Grassland ecosystem is characterized by vegetation. The vegetation, depending on the size and type of vegetation, can be forest, savanna, or desert, and that defines the type of grassland. And so, by definition, we have the forest vegetation, we have the savanna vegetation, and we have the desert vegetation. They are all grassland vegetation. Factors affecting organisms in an ecosystem. That's our next consideration. Factors affecting organisms in an ecosystem. Remember, we say the interaction is between the biotic and the abiotic factors. So it is important we also separate our factors into biotic and abiotic. So we start with the abiotic. or what we also call the physical factors, abiotic factors, or the physical factors that can affect living organisms in the ecosystem. The first one is climatic factors. These days we are talking about climate change, and it includes factors like temperature, rainfall, relative humidity, light. In light, we can talk about the light intensity and the duration of the light, wind, either the speed of the wind and the direction it is going, is flowing. And so these are all called climatic factors. In the course of lectures, we'll see them one after the other. But these factors influence one another. Temperature influences rainfall, and rainfall influences temperature. And both can also influence relative humidity. And all of this can be influenced by light intensity and duration, and wind. So they are all interrelated. And so they are grouped under climatic factors. We have the edaphic factors. I told you before that edaphic means soil. We have the edaphic habitat or soil habitat. And in this case, the edaphic factors are soil factors like soil texture, soil moisture, and soil humus content. Soil texture means the feel of the soil. In terms of soil texture, we have the coarse soil, which is called sand. We have the one that is less coarse. We have the loamy soil, and we have the clay soil. So these are all aspects of, and organisms, whether plants or animals, determine their presence in a particular soil is determined by the texture of this soil, whether sand, loam, or clay. And soil moisture has to do with the quantity of water, the amount of moisture, water in the soil. And soil humus has to do with the soil organic content, or the fertility of the soil. This determines the type of vegetation. All these, texture, moisture, and humus content, will determine the type of vegetation in a particular habitat, which in turn determine the types of animals that are living in that habitat. So these are biotic factors, two essential with sub factors, climatic and edaphic. The biotic factors are those factors that influence other living organisms in a habitat. Influence of other living organisms in a habitat. One organism will influence the existence of another organism in the same habitat. In different ways, there are different ways of these influences. For example, competition. If there are two organisms in the same habitat, and they need the same requirement, food requirement or shelter requirement, there will be competition over these requirements. The one that takes the bigger part survives. The other one does not survive. And that is where we call survival for the fittest. And in this case, the one that survives better. Some necessarily may not be extinct or excluded from that habitat, but their life may be affected, and so they may not strive very well. And so competition, predation, and parasitism are biotic factors that can affect. Another concept is what we call the ecotypes. Ecotypes. These are variations among populations of the same species in a habitat. Variations among populations of the same species in a habitat. These variations may be phenotypic or genotypic. Phenotypic means physical variations in a given population. Some people are dark complexion, others are light complexion. Complexion is what we can see, phenotypic. But there are genotypic variations also. The genotype. For example, people have different blood groups, A, B, or the A, or A, B, or O, and so on, blood groups. But you cannot see a person in the face and say you have blood group that until it is tested. This is not physical, so it is genotypic. And so in some of these variations may be just phenotypic, genotypic, or both phenotype and genotype. We also have what we call the biotypes. Uniform habitat with same environmental conditions and same populations, such as communities, occur mostly in small and artificial ponds. When they occur, when we have such organisms or such communities occurring in very small and artificial area, we call it a biotype. It's not the entire environment. It's a small a type typifying or exemplifying or representing what would happen in the bigger environment, and so it's a biotype. We also have ecological niche, the sum total of the activities of an organism in an ecosystem. Each species of organism occupies its niche and avoids competition. It's a concept that has been developed by organisms to reduce competition, so that the sharing of resources within the same environment will be equitable to the organism. So organisms select where they can get their best of resources and avoid where they can suffer the harm of competition from other organisms. And in this case, where organisms live together, we'll talk about cohabitation or coexistence, even within the same ecological niche. We will go ahead now to talk about what we call ecological succession. It's another concept or principle in ecology. Ecological succession defined as a gradual stage by stage building up. A gradual stage by stage building up of a stable, complex, and climax community from the scratch. What we call communities today didn't just come up over one day. They took time, over time, to become stable. And the process of having this from nothing to something, the entire process is called the colonization process of a habitat. And it has three key stages. The colonization stages, there are three stages. One is called the primary stage. Then we have the secondary and the climax stages of colonization. Remember, we have said succession means a gradual stage by stage. So the first stage is the primary stage. And this is initiated by what we call the pioneer. And these pioneers are usually plants, lower plants called algae, where you have a place that has never been inhabited, either a rock surface or something thereabout, or a pool of water that has just gathered. Nothing, nobody, nothing, no organism lives there. And then the first occupants are called algae. They are usually plant forms. They are called the primary successors. Algae, the initial or pioneer or primary successors. By virtue of their living in that environment, they create certain changes in the environment. And sometimes those changes become deleterious or become inimical to their own survival. But they create a stage for another set of organisms to come in. This new stage is now called the secondary stage, or the secondary population, who will form and replace the pioneers. The pioneers sometimes may be completely replaced, and so they move on to look for another new ground. So the pioneers sometimes call them ground breakers, fresh ground breakers. But when they have broken the ground and make it suitable, secondary successors will come in and replace them. And of course, they must be higher than them to replace them. They must have an higher advantage over the pioneers. And then, over time, activities of these secondary successors will also create a new habitat suitable for a new set of organisms, until gradually a replacement process keeps on taking place. And now a climax and stable lasting community is formed. When this climax community is formed, we are not expecting any replacement anymore. And in this case, we have gone through primary, secondary, and we are now at a climax stable community, and all populations can occupy this new community and coexist or cohabitate. So features of succession include predictability, directional. A succession should be predictable and it should be directional, and there should be environmental modifiers. As I said, every stage modifies the form for that area for the next set of occupants. So there must be some environmental modification, and it is characterized by disappearance of the older organisms disappearing and being replacement of species. And then as these are happening, there is an increase or decrease of biomass, and the climax community with maximum biomass and stable, complex, diverse organisms will now come to exist, and that is a climax complex community. Those are the stages in a succession. I have talked about cohabitation and coexistence, but there are slight difference between these two. So we go. Organisms of different species living together, that is cohabitation. Organisms of different species, remember the word different species, living together in different niches within the same habitat. The same habitat, niche here, but different species occupying that habitat, but different niches, they are cohabitating. So cohabitants, those cohabitating organisms are called cohabitants. They explore different resources. That is why they have different niches, different resources in the same habitat, thereby avoiding competition. So one of the key values of cohabitants is to avoid or reduce competition to the barest minimum. They do that by formation of niches. Cohabitants may feed on the same resource, but on the same source, but at different times. Some may be nocturnal, some may be diurnal. And so if they are feeding on the same resource, so come in the night and feed. By the day they go down to their hiding places, and the others who feed in the day will come. In that case, they are not competing. You reduce competition. So one of the essential features is to reduce competition by cohabitants. But coexistence is similar to cohabitation, but differ in a certain number of ways. One, they may compete for same resource in the habitat. Cohabitants don't compete. That's why some come in the night, some come in the day. This one, they may coexistence may lead to competition for resources. They may also serve as food for each other, one eating one another, either as predator or prey, and so on and so forth like that. And they may benefit, both of them may benefit by virtue of living together. Or they may also live their independent lives. So these are features of coexistence. We look at some feeding relationship in ecology. Feeding relationships in ecology. This is another heading. Organisms in their natural habitats are faced with the problem of how to obtain energy and nutrients to survive, to reproduce, and to grow. And so feeding has to do with sources of food that will help us survive, help every organism to survive, plants or animals. And when after survival, the next phase is to reproduce, and when there is a production, growth. So this cannot take place without nutrients. And the way we secure these nutrients is by feeding relationship. So, what organism feed on and what they feed, what feeds on them is about feeding relationship. When we talk about feeding, we are just asking the question, what does this organism feed on, and what is it that feeds on this organism? Organisms are divided into two groups on the basis of feeding relationship. We have the autotrophs, which are called producers. They are essentially plants. Autotrophs, producers, they are plants. These are green plants that make use of simple inorganic substances from their surrounding to produce food. So this group of organisms that are called producers, they don't wait for anybody. They go ahead and produce their own. They have the capacity to produce their own they use simple inorganic substances to produce their own food. And these simple inorganic substances are not found from anywhere. They are just found within their surrounding. Their requirements include, the requirements for producing this food include light, water, carbon dioxide, and inorganic ions such as nitrates. Light from the environment, water from the same environment, carbon dioxide. So light, water, carbon dioxide, and inorganic substances. So 2 categories of autotrophs. There may be phototrophs. They use sunlight as the source of energy. And then we have chemotrophs. They use chemicals as energy sources. So heterotrophs, that is the next set of feeding relationship, levels of feeding. We have the first one as autotrophs, and this one is heterotrophs. Heterotrophs. These are also called consumers, and they are essentially animals. They depend on the autotrophs for their food sources. In that case, they do not have the ability to produce their own food sources. Instead, they wait for the producers to produce, and they feed. That's why they are called consumers. They consume, and these are essentially animals. And the process of consumption is either by ingestion, by digestion, absorption, assimilation, and excretion. This goes through these processes. So they consume by ingestion, by digestion, absorption, assimilation, and excretion. Types of heterotrophs. Heterotrophic nutrition. There are several types. One is called holozoic. Holozoic. Feeding on large molecules. This is essentially herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores. They feed on large molecules. So there are different kinds of holozoic nutrition. When they are herbivores, they feed essentially on plant and plant products. If they are carnivores, they feed on flesh only. And if they are omnivores, they feed on both plant products and flesh products. Then the other types of heterotrophic nutrition is we have the parasitic nutrition, or a relationship between parasites feeding on their host. We'll look at that in the course of lectures. We also have the saprophytic. In this case, saprophytes feeding on decaying or decayed organic substances. They are very good to the society community, or else we would have been having liters of substances all around us that have dead and are not decayed or are not fed on. So they clear the environment by feeding on decayed organic substances. Saprophytic nutrition, or saprophytes. And we have symbiotic feeding, or symbiotic nutrition, which includes it depends is an interdependencies in feeding. Symbiotic means friendly, all forms of associations. Symbiotic. We'll now be looking at what we call trophic levels. These are the arrangement of organisms according to their feeding position in a community is called the trophic level. There are 3 trophic levels in an ecosystem. So we place the organism according to the trophic level where they belong. And the major trophic levels, we have the producer, or the autotrophs, we have said it, the consumer, which are animals, the holozones, the parasites, and the symbionts. And then we have the decomposers. And normally, if we are to create, as we will see later, food chains, we must take cognizance of this. A good food chain must start from producers. to consumers, and then it must end with decomposers. And if there would be series, there can be series of producers and a large array of consumers, even consuming each other before they finally go to the stage of decomposition. And so feeding interrelationships in an ecosystem is expressed either as a food chain or a food web. So we have food chains and food webs. Food chains are linear. That's why they call it chain. Chain is a linear, straight line. A single line feeding relationship, single line feeding arrangement. This one feeds this on, this feeds on this, or this is supplying energy, A is supplying energy to B, B is supplying energy to C, and C is supplying energy to D. A straight line. In other words, D feeds on C, C feeds on B, B feeds on A, and so A must be a producer, B and C may be consumers, and D could be a decomposer. And in that case, energy is recycled. As it decomposes, it goes back to the producer. We'll look at later energy cycles in a community, or energy cycles in an ecosystem. So we also have what we call food webs. It is not usual to have it in a straight chain. You may have A as a producer and you have B as a consumer feeding directly on A. You could have another consumer feeding on the other side from A. So it's no longer a straight line. And you could have a D somewhere which is feeding on both C and D and B. And so the whole thing becomes a web instead of a chain. And it becomes complex. So a food web is more complex, that with cross lines showing feeding relationship here and there between organisms. So we also have what we call ecological pyramids, the quantity or number of biomass illustrated in a feeding relationship. And there are several types of pyramids. So it is important to note that a pyramid deals with feeding relationship that, as we've said, the pyramid is when we have the pyramid of number, we are talking about the number of organisms that are at the lower trophic levels, middle trophic levels, and the upper trophic levels. And it is usually required that the pyramid is represented as a triangle. It means that you need, for example, if I were to make a pyramid of numbers, starting with grasshoppers. Okay, grass being eaten by grasshoppers, and the grasshoppers being eaten by lizard. For example, a 3-stage. The lizard will need many grasshoppers, not just one. One lizard will need many grasshoppers, and one grasshopper will need many plants to feed on. And in that case, at every lower stage, there are more organisms to feed the next level, and so it narrows down gradually to a triangle, with the top being smaller than the bottom. But we also have the pyramid of biomass, the quantity of mass that is required at each level of 3 important things to note in feeding relationship. 1, an ideal feeding relationship goes from producers through consumers and decomposers. I have emphasized on this. So if we are to draw a good feeding relationship, to produce a good feeding relationship, we must carefully look at it that the starting point is a producer, and then next is a consumer, and it has to end with a decomposer. It is also important to note that shorter food, the shorter the feeding position, the better. The organisms that are closer to the producers, they get more advantage. The ones that are further away, they need more of the organism they are feeding on. And it's also number 3 thing to note is that diagrammatic representation of feeding relationship will facilitate our understanding of this concept. I will advise students to read, to look through our resources and check diagrammatic representation of feeding relationship and food chains, food waste, pyramid of numbers, and pyramid of biomass. Our next lecture is interactions in an ecosystem, or what we call associations, biological associations, interactions in an ecosystem. Remember, we said ecology is all about interaction between organisms and the environment. So living organisms that live together in different ways, and there are different types of interactions among them. We have competition, predation, parasitism, symbiosis, commensalism, and saprophytism. These are some of the interactions that we will be studying in the course of our lectures. Competition, where organisms are competing over the same resource. The one that gets the better part of it survives. The one that is less adapted and cannot get the better part of the resource may be eliminated. Predation is where you have a prey or a predator catching a prey and eating. Parasitism is between a relationship between a parasite and a host. Symbiosis means interacting together. Commensalism meaning one organism benefiting, the other one is neither benefiting and is not also being harmed. Saprophytism means feeding on decaying matter. Adaptation by organisms to different environment. Organisms just need to adapt to environment, or else they will not be able to live in those environments. And these are ways. Adaptation means ways of increasing our chances of reproducing and surviving in an environment. Organisms have to find ways of increasing their chances of living in an environment, reproducing, and surviving. There are 3 forms of adaptation by animals, and there are other forms. Animals have their own adaptation. Plants also have different types of adaptation. And in these forms, we call the first one morphological or structural adaptation. Morphology means what, or structural, how the animals is made up of physical appearance. Organisms that must need to eat from deep crevices, like birds, they need a beak that will go deep into the crevices and obtain their food. Insects that will feed on nectar, they need a mouth part that will pierce into a nectar and bring out flower. Insects like mosquito that will feed on blood from their host will need what will secure their food sources from the host. And these are all morphological structures that enables the feeding structures. They are called morphological adaptation. We also have physiological adaptation, where the organism's physiology, the make-up of the body, enables it to live in an environment. And then finally we have behavioral adaptation, the entire behavior of the organism. When it is hot, we know how to cover ourselves. It's a behavior. And when it is cold, we know how to put on light clothing. These are behavior. And so on and so forth. All these are adaptation that organisms will use to survive. Plants also have their own. And adaptation for reproduction, adaptation for survival, we have xerophytes, the hydrophytes, the halophytes, and the mesophytes or epiphytes. Xerophytes, plants that can survive in desert environment. They are succulent plants. Hydrophytes, plants that live in water, and so they have their way of surviving there, and so on and so forth. And our next case of study will be to look at how habitat studies can occur. How habitat studies, how we can study the habitat. We say the habitat is the most critical place where the organism lives. There are different ways of studying the habitat, and that will be our next lecture. Thank you. See you in another class.